There is a version of the Vietnam War that was taught in schools, discussed in documentaries, and acknowledged by governments. It has dates, names, and a defined ending. It has a wall in Washington with 58,000 names carved into black granite. That version is real, but it is not complete. Alongside it, running parallel to it like a shadow highway, was another war, one that existed in classified cables, in orders that were never written down, in the silence of men who came home and were specifically told, by officers whose names they would never know, that certain things they had witnessed were not to be repeated. Not to their wives, not to their doctors, not to any journalist, not ever. Some of those men kept that promise for the rest of their lives. Others broke it slowly, in fragments, in Veterans Administration waiting rooms, in late-night conversations with other veterans who'd been given the same instructions. What emerged from those fragments, cross-referenced with documents that were eventually declassified decades later, with investigative journalism that took years to surface, and with testimony from soldiers who decided that dying with the secret was worse than speaking it, is a picture of the Vietnam War that is fundamentally different from the one in the textbooks. Not different in its geography or its casualty figures, different in its logic. Different in who was making decisions and why, and what those decisions were actually intended to accomplish. This script is not an argument. It is not a condemnation. It is a documentation of 19 specific truths about the Vietnam War that soldiers were explicitly or implicitly warned never to repeat, and an explanation of why those truths were suppressed, what systems were built to maintain that suppression, and what it cost the people who carried those truths in silence for the rest of their lives. The first truth is one that cuts directly against the most fundamental narrative of the American involvement in Vietnam, which is that the United States entered the war to stop communist aggression and to defend a sovereign democratic nation. That narrative required a specific legal justification, and that justification was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. On August 2nd and August 4th of 1964, the Johnson administration reported to Congress and to the American public that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked 2 United States Navy destroyers in international waters, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy. The August 2nd attack was real. It was a genuine engagement between North Vietnamese patrol boats and the Maddox, though even that attack occurred in a context the administration did not disclose, which was that the Maddox had been conducting electronic intelligence operations in support of covert South Vietnamese raids against North Vietnamese coastal installations. The August 4th attack, the one that Johnson used to secure congressional authorization for massive military escalation, did not happen. It was fabricated, or more precisely, it was a combination of nervous radar operators misinterpreting their own equipment in rough seas, trigger-happy gunners firing at shadows, and a chain of command that needed a second attack to justify a resolution that had already been drafted. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara knew within 48 hours that the August 4th attack was almost certainly fictional. He told President Johnson. Johnson already knew. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed anyway, 98-2 in the Senate, and it gave the president essentially unlimited authority to wage war in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration. Captain John Herrick, the commander of the Naval Task Force, sent a message hours after the alleged second attack that said the entire action leaves many doubts and that a complete evaluation before any further action was needed. That message was suppressed. The resolution passed. The war escalated. Soldiers were sent into a conflict whose legal foundation rested on an event that the men who manufactured it knew had not occurred. The second truth concerns the real scale and nature of the Phoenix program, which was one of the most systematic and deliberately obscured operations of the entire war. The official description of Phoenix was that it was a pacification and intelligence program designed to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure, meaning the political and organizational network that sustained the insurgency. That description is technically accurate in the same way that describing a slaughterhouse as a food processing facility is technically accurate. The Phoenix program, run jointly by the CIA, the South Vietnamese National Police, and various American military advisory units, compiled lists of suspected Viet Cong members, sympathizers, and infrastructure personnel, and then had those individuals captured, interrogated, or killed. Between 1968 and 1972, according to the program's own records, more than 20,000 people were killed under Phoenix. South Vietnamese officials later put the number higher. The problem that soldiers who operated within or adjacent to Phoenix were warned never to discuss was not the killing itself, which was formally acknowledged, but the methodology by which people ended up on the lists. Provincial reconnaissance units, the paramilitary teams that carried out Phoenix operations, were often composed of former criminals, motivated by financial incentives, operating with almost no oversight in rural areas where American advisors rarely went. Killing a suspect was worth more than capturing one because capturing one required paperwork, interrogation, and the bureaucratic machinery of detention. Dead suspects, closed cases. Village chiefs submitted names to settle personal vendettas. Local officials submitted names of people who owned land they wanted. Rivals submitted names of business competitors. The system had no reliable mechanism for distinguishing genuine Viet Cong infrastructure personnel from civilians who had been named for reasons that had nothing to do with the war. Soldiers who raised these concerns inside the program were reassigned. Those who raised them outside the program were investigated. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, contained extensive material on Phoenix, but most of that material was never published in the initial newspaper stories because editors focused on the strategic decisions at the top, the operational reality at the bottom, the reality that soldiers lived inside, remained classified for years afterward. The third truth involves the systematic underreporting of American casualties, a practice that was not occasional or accidental, but was built into the reporting structure itself. The official casualty figures for Vietnam are among the most scrutinized numbers in American military history, and even those official figures tell a story of bureaucratic manipulation. Deaths had to be categorized. The categories mattered enormously because they determined whether a death showed up in the politically sensitive combat casualty reports that Congress and the public tracked, or whether they disappeared into other categories. Soldiers who were wounded in combat and then died in hospitals in Japan, the Philippines, or the continental United States were often recorded as having died of disease or non-hostile causes. Soldiers who died in accidents that occurred during combat operations, from friendly fire, from equipment failures during missions, were sometimes categorized in ways that removed them from the combat death count. The Defense Department's own internal studies, several of which were conducted in the 1970s after the war and were not declassified until decades later, acknowledged that the official casualty figures had significant anomalies that suggested systematic undercounting. Veterans who had been medical personnel, who had worked in field hospitals, in evacuation chains, in graves registration units, were specifically cautioned that mortality data they had access to was classified and was not to be discussed publicly. Some of them compared notes years later and found consistent patterns across different units, different regions, and different years that pointed to the same conclusion. The real human cost of the war was administratively managed to stay within a range that would not trigger a political crisis faster than the war's architects could manage. The fourth truth concerns the use of chemical agents in Vietnam and the deliberate concealment of their effects. Agent Orange is now acknowledged. The acknowledgement came slowly, over decades, through litigation and congressional pressure, and it still understates the scale of what was done. Between 1961 and 1971, the United States military sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicides over South Vietnam, eastern Laos, and parts of Cambodia. Agent Orange was the most widely used, and it contained dioxin, specifically TCDD, which is one of the most toxic compounds ever synthesized and which causes cancer, neurological disorders, and genetic damage that can be passed to subsequent generations. Soldiers were told the herbicides were harmless to humans. They walked through freshly sprayed areas. They bathed in water that had been contaminated by aerial applications. They ate food grown in soil that had been treated. Military advisors watched Vietnamese children play in areas that had been sprayed hours before. When soldiers began reporting health problems in the late 1960s and early 1970s, military doctors were instructed to record their symptoms under general categories that would not link them to herbicide exposure. The Veterans Administration, for years after the war, denied that there was any established link between Agent Orange exposure and the health conditions veterans were reporting. Internal documents from the chemical companies that manufactured the herbicides, documents that were eventually produced in litigation, showed that those companies had known about the toxicity of dioxin contamination since the 1950s and had not disclosed it to the military or to the government. The soldiers who were told the sprays were harmless and who later developed cancers and watched their children born with birth defects had been lied to with full institutional knowledge. The instruction not to discuss herbicide exposure came from base commanders, from military doctors, and from Veterans Administration intake officers. It was systemic. The fifth truth is about the real nature of the free fire zone policy and what it meant for the people who lived inside those zones. Free fire zones, which the military preferred to call specified strike zones in its official communications, were geographic areas in which all inhabitants were presumed to be hostile and in which American and South Vietnamese forces were authorized to engage any target without prior clearance. The theory behind the policy was that civilians had been warned to relocate to secure areas, and therefore anyone remaining in a designated zone was either Viet Cong or a Viet Cong sympathizer. The practice was entirely different. The warnings were inadequate, delivered in languages that many rural Vietnamese either did not speak or could not read, through leaflet drops over areas where literacy rates were low. Relocation to secure areas meant leaving land that families had farmed for generations, abandoning everything that constituted their material existence, moving into refugee camps that were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and administered by a South Vietnamese government whose relationship with its own rural population was, in many areas, indistinguishable from occupation. Many civilians did not leave. Some did not know they were in a free fire zone. Some knew and had nowhere to go. When they were killed in free fire zones, they were counted as enemy combatants in the body count. The body count was the primary metric by which the war's progress was measured and reported to Congress and to the public. Commanders faced pressure to produce favorable body counts. The incentive structure was explicit. High body counts meant career advancement, recognition, the metrics that determined promotion. Low body counts meant questions, scrutiny, the suggestion that a unit was not performing. Soldiers who questioned whether the bodies being counted were actually combatants, who pointed out that a dead old woman in a rice paddy was not a Viet Cong soldier, were told to keep their observations to themselves. The body count fraud was not a local or occasional distortion. It was built into the system's incentives from the beginning, and the people who built those incentives understood what they were doing. The sixth truth concerns the massacres that were never investigated. My lie is known because Hugh Thompson, a helicopter pilot, reported it up the chain of command, and because Seymour Hersh eventually broke the story, and because the story was so undeniable in its scale, with over 500 civilians killed in a single village on a single morning, that it could not be fully buried. But my lie was not singular. Internal Army records, specifically the Tiger Force investigation that was conducted in the early 1970s and was classified for decades, documented that a small elite unit of the 101st Airborne Division had committed systematic atrocities across a period of months in 1967, killing civilians, mutilating bodies, wearing the ears of victims as trophies. The Army investigated Tiger Force for more than 4 years, built a criminal case against 18 soldiers, and then quietly closed the investigation without charging anyone. The decision to close the investigation was made at the Department of the Army level. Soldiers who had witnessed Tiger Force operations, who had been interviewed during the investigation and had given testimony about specific killings, were instructed that the investigation was classified and that their testimony was not to be discussed. The Toledo Blade published the Tiger Force story in 2003, 36 years after the events occurred, based on documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. By that time, most of the relevant officers had retired. Several had received commendations. The sixth truth is not only that atrocities beyond my lie occurred, it is that the institutional response to those atrocities was administrative burial rather than accountability, and that the soldiers who participated in those burials, who signed the non-disclosure instructions, who closed the files, understood exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. The seventh truth involves the systematic use of American forces in operations that were never officially acknowledged to have taken place. The war in Laos is the most extensive example. Under the terms of the 1962 Geneva Accords, Laos was officially neutral. The United States officially respected that neutrality. Unofficially, the CIA had been running a covert war in Laos since the late 1950s, arming and directing the Hmong army under General Vang Pao, conducting bombing operations, inserting special forces teams, and running a logistical infrastructure that at its peak was larger than most acknowledged military operations. The Air America airline, a CIA proprietary, flew throughout Laos conducting operations that were classified at the highest levels. American pilots flew bombing missions over Laos and filed flight logs that described the missions in terms that concealed their location. Soldiers who served in Laos under various cover assignments were given specific instructions before they deployed and upon return. They had not been to Laos. They had not participated in operations in Laos, and any documentation of their service would reflect assignments in other locations. The bombing of Laos was, by tonnage, the most intensive aerial bombardment of any country in history per capita. More bombs were dropped on Laos during the Vietnam War than were dropped on all of Europe during the entire Second World War. That fact was not publicly known while it was happening. Veterans of those operations spent years unable to discuss where they had been or what they had done, unable to obtain treatment for health conditions that had developed during classified deployments, unable to receive recognition for service that officially had not occurred. The eighth truth concerns the relationship between the American military command and the South Vietnamese government, and specifically the degree to which American officials understood that the government they were fighting to preserve was not, in any meaningful sense, democratic or popular. The internal assessments produced by the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, many of which were included in the Pentagon Papers, and many of which remained classified long after the Pentagon Papers were published, consistently described the South Vietnamese government in terms that were fundamentally incompatible with the public justification for American involvement. In 1963, the Kennedy administration was receiving intelligence reports that described President Diem's government as having lost the confidence of the rural population, as being dependent on a security apparatus that was generating more enemies than it was neutralizing, and as being constitutionally incapable of the political reforms that would be necessary to build genuine popular support. Kennedy authorized the coup that removed Diem. The coup resulted in Diem's murder. The succession of governments that followed were described in internal assessments as military cliques with no significant popular legitimacy. The Tet Offensive in 1968 demonstrated conclusively that the claim that the South Vietnamese government controlled its territory was false, because Viet Cong forces were able to simultaneously attack 36 of 44 provincial capitals and hold them for varying periods, which was operationally impossible if the insurgency had actually been contained. Soldiers who had served in advisory roles, who had worked directly with South Vietnamese military and government counterparts, were frequently aware that the portrait being presented to the American public bore no relationship to what they were observing on the ground. They were told that the strategic picture was classified, that their tactical-level observations did not reflect the larger strategic reality, and that speculation about Vietnamese political will was above their pay grade. The ninth truth is about what the prisoners of war experienced and what was known about their treatment that was deliberately withheld from their families and from the public. The official position of the American government during the war was that American prisoners of war in North Vietnam were being treated in accordance with the Geneva Conventions and that the government was doing everything possible to secure their release. The internal reality, documented in debriefings of returned prisoners after Operation Homecoming in 1973, was that American prisoners had been subjected to systematic torture, including prolonged stress positions, beatings, rope bindings that caused nerve damage, prolonged isolation, mock executions, and deprivation of food and medical care. The North Vietnamese prison system, centered on the Hoa Lo prison in Hanoi, which prisoners called the Hanoi Hilton, operated on the explicit premise that prisoners were war criminals rather than prisoners of war, and that the Geneva Conventions therefore did not apply. American prisoners were used for propaganda purposes, photographed making statements of confession or anti-war sentiment that had been extracted through torture. The government knew this was happening. The families of prisoners were not told the full truth about the conditions because the government feared that public outrage about prisoner treatment would force a political response that would complicate ongoing negotiations. Returned prisoners who described their treatment publicly were initially discouraged from doing so by military officials who framed the debriefing process as a matter of operational security. The full testimony of returned prisoners was classified and did not enter the public record for years. The 10th truth concerns the drug epidemic within the American military in Vietnam, which was documented internally at rates that would have been politically catastrophic if they had been accurately reported. By 1971, internal Army studies estimated that between 20 and 25% of American soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin regularly, and that the percentage using marijuana or other substances was significantly higher. The heroin available in Vietnam was extraordinarily pure, significantly more potent than what was available in the United States, and it was widely and cheaply available because elements of the South Vietnamese government and military, which the United States was arming and supporting, were involved in the heroin trade. Air America, the CIA proprietary airline, was documented in internal investigations as having transported opium and heroin as part of its operations in the Golden Triangle region. Those internal investigations, conducted in the early 1970s, were classified. The CIA's Inspector General reports on the matter were not fully declassified until decades later. Soldiers who had witnessed drug shipments, who had personal knowledge of the involvement of South Vietnamese officials in the narcotics trade, who had seen American aircraft used for narcotics transport, were debriefed and instructed that what they had seen was classified intelligence information. The official response to the drug epidemic was a series of amnesty programs and urinalysis testing that was publicly presented as an aggressive response to a problem that had just been discovered. The internal documentation showed that the problem had been known and tracked for years and had not been addressed because addressing it would have required confronting the political relationships that were sustaining it. The 11th truth involves the systematic falsification of military intelligence assessments, a practice that was not isolated to any single unit or command level, but that was embedded in the reporting culture from the ground up. The problem began with the body count, which was the primary metric by which progress was measured and reported, and which created an incentive for every level of the reporting chain to inflate numbers. It did not end there. After-action reports, which documented the outcomes of military operations, were subject to the same pressures. Operations that had resulted in tactical failures, in significant American casualties without proportional results, were reported in ways that reframed them as successes. The concept of the crossover point, the moment at which American forces would be killing enemy combatants faster than they could be replaced, was a central premise of the military's strategic assessment for years. General Westmoreland and his staff repeatedly told Congress and the White House that the crossover point was being approached, that enemy strength was declining, that the war of attrition was working. The CIA's own intelligence assessments and the assessments produced by the Defense Intelligence Agency consistently disputed these claims. An internal battle over the enemy order of battle, the official estimate of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces in the south, stretched over more than a year in 1967 and involved explicit political pressure on intelligence analysts to lower their estimates to conform to the strategic narrative that Westmoreland was presenting. Analysts who produced honest estimates that contradicted the official story were reassigned. The fraudulent intelligence assessment that preceded the Tet Offensive, the assessment that said enemy strength was declining and that the insurgency was being degraded, made the offensive's actual scale a shock to the American military command and to the public simultaneously. The 12th truth is about the role of the press and the specific mechanisms by which the military managed information access in ways that were far more systematic than is generally understood. The image of the Vietnam War as the first television war, the uncensored war, the war that brought combat into American living rooms, contains enough truth to obscure a more complex reality. There was no formal censorship of the press in Vietnam of the kind that had operated in the Second World War, but there were accreditation systems, background briefing protocols, and access restrictions that functioned as informal censorship mechanisms. Reporters who produced stories that the command found damaging to the war effort found their access restricted. Stories about specific operations, specific programs, specific aspects of the war were identified as sensitive, and reporters who pursued them found that their sources dried up, that military transport was suddenly unavailable, that the cooperative relationships they had built with officers were quietly severed. The daily military briefings in Saigon, which reporters called the 5 o'clock follies, produced statistics and assessments that reporters increasingly understood to be fictional, but which were difficult to disprove because the documentation behind them was classified. Reporters who produced accurate stories about the gap between official claims and field reality were pressured by their own editors, who were pressured by advertisers, by government officials, by the climate of a country that did not want to believe that the war was not going well. The soldiers who talked to reporters, who described what they were actually experiencing, were not protected by any formal whistleblower mechanism. They were subject to military law, to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and to informal retaliations that could follow them through their entire military careers. The 13th truth concerns Cambodia and the bombing campaign that was conducted there for 14 months from March 1969 to May 1970, before the existence of the campaign was disclosed even internally to most of the government. Operation Menu, the bombing of Cambodian sanctuaries, was authorized by President Nixon and National Security Advisor Kissinger, and was kept secret not only from the public and from Congress, but from most of the Pentagon's own command structure. The Joint Chiefs were informed, the Secretary of Defense was informed, almost no one else was. A dual reporting system was created in which the actual targets and bomb damage assessments were recorded in a separate, highly classified system, while official reports recorded the missions as having been conducted over South Vietnam. Pilots and air crews who flew the Cambodia missions were told explicitly that the missions did not exist, that they had not taken place, and that any mention of them would be a violation of classified information protocols. The Air Force Inspector General's office, which normally reviewed all targeting and bombing records, was excluded from access to the menu records. When Senator William Fulbright began asking questions in the Senate about reports of American bombing in Cambodia, the Air Force produced the falsified records rather than the real ones. 14 months of intense bombing of a nominally neutral country, killing thousands of Cambodian civilians and destabilizing a government that would eventually fall to the Khmer Rouge, was conducted through a system specifically designed to be invisible to any oversight mechanism. The soldiers who flew those missions, who knew what they had done and where they had done it, were carrying secrets that had been institutionally engineered to be impossible to tell. The 14th truth is about the fragging phenomenon, which was more widespread than the official record acknowledges, and which represented something that the military command found deeply threatening to narrate honestly. Fragging, the killing or attempted killing of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own troops, typically using fragmentation grenades, became significant enough in Vietnam to constitute a documented pattern beginning around 1969. The official Pentagon records acknowledge 788 fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972, with 86 officers and NCOs killed. Most researchers who have studied the available evidence believe those numbers significantly undercount the actual incidents because the category required a high threshold of evidence, because many incidents were recorded as accidents or as enemy action, and because there were strong institutional pressures against acknowledging a breakdown of military discipline at that scale. The fragging phenomenon was not random violence. It was, in most documented cases, the result of specific grievances. Officers ordering suicidal missions after the troop withdrawal had begun, and the war's outcome was already clearly determined. Officers enforcing petty disciplinary standards while men were dying, officers whose incompetence was getting their soldiers killed and who were protected by the system from the consequences. The soldiers who committed fragging incidents were not, in the majority of documented cases, sociopathic or randomly violent. They were men who had concluded that the institutional mechanisms for protecting them from incompetent or dangerous leadership had failed and who had taken matters into their own hands. The military's response was to classify fragging data, to discourage investigation of individual incidents, and to present the phenomenon to the public as isolated rather than systemic. Officers who discussed fragging openly, who wrote about its causes honestly, faced professional consequences. The 15th truth involves the long-term psychological damage to veterans and the deliberate failure of the medical and administrative system to address it. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not identified as a formal diagnostic category until 1980, but the condition it describes was thoroughly documented in military medical records from Vietnam under different names long before it was officially acknowledged. Internal Army studies conducted during the war documented what was then called combat exhaustion, combat fatigue, and various other terms at rates that were significantly higher than the rates being disclosed publicly. Veterans who returned from Vietnam and sought help from the Veterans Administration for what they described as nightmares, hypervigilance, flashbacks, inability to maintain relationships, explosive anger, and social withdrawal, were frequently told that they had no diagnosable condition, that their problems were character disorders, or that they were seeking disability benefits fraudulently. The instruction not to speak about what they had done and seen, which had been delivered in various forms during and after their service, combined with a treatment system that was institutionally unprepared and often hostile to the reality of psychological war trauma, produced a generation of men who were carrying experiences they had been told they could not describe, and a medical system that was telling them those experiences had not affected them. The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans, documented across several decades of follow-up studies, significantly exceeded the suicide rate among the general population and among veterans of other wars. The administrative response was to dispute the data, to contest the methodology of the studies, and to delay for as long as possible the formal acknowledgement of the scale of the psychological damage the war had produced. The 16th truth concerns the private negotiations and the political manipulation of the peace process in ways that extended the war by years and cost tens of thousands of additional lives. The public narrative of the peace negotiations is that they were long, difficult, and ultimately successful, resulting in the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973. The private reality, documented in National Security Council records, in the papers of various participants that were declassified over subsequent decades, and in reporting that was available in fragments during the war, but which was suppressed or dismissed, is considerably darker. In 1968, with peace negotiations beginning in Paris and the Johnson administration working toward an agreement that might have ended the war before the November election, the Nixon campaign, through various intermediaries, made contact with the South Vietnamese government and encouraged them to resist the negotiations, with the implication that a Nixon administration would provide better terms. The South Vietnamese government, which had been told it could expect a better deal from Nixon, withdrew from the negotiations. The talks collapsed. The war continued for 5 more years. Lyndon Johnson knew about the contact and described it privately as treason. He chose not to disclose it publicly because doing so would have required revealing that the knowledge came from intelligence surveillance of the Nixon campaign and the South Vietnamese embassy. The people who knew, who had been part of the intelligence collection that documented the contact, were operating in a classified environment where the information could not be disclosed without exposing sources and methods. The soldiers who died between 1968 and 1973, the Vietnamese civilians who died in those 5 additional years, died in a war that had been extended for domestic political reasons by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The 17th truth is about the systematic abandonment of Vietnamese who had worked with and for the American military and intelligence apparatus, and what happened to many of them after the American withdrawal. The South Vietnamese who had served as interpreters, intelligence assets, provincial reconnaissance unit members, and in countless other roles in direct support of American operations, had been told, explicitly in many cases, that their service would be remembered and that they would not be left behind. The promise was made by individual officers, by CIA case officers, by advisors who had worked alongside these men and women for years. When the end came in April 1975, the evacuation was chaotic, inadequate, and ultimately left hundreds of thousands of people who had worked for the American government to face a North Vietnamese regime that treated collaboration with the Americans as a capital offense or an offense meriting long-term imprisonment in what were called re-education camps. American soldiers and intelligence officers who had made personal promises to their Vietnamese counterparts, who had developed relationships over years of working together, watched from the decks of ships or from the windows of departing aircraft, as the people they had promised to protect were left on the ground. Many of them spent years afterward trying through unofficial channels to get their former colleagues out. Some succeeded, many did not. The institutional response to their efforts was indifference. The documents that might have expedited evacuations or later immigration cases were classified. The formal processes moved at the pace of bureaucratic time, while people were dying at the pace of political time. The 18th truth concerns the specific and documented use of torture by American forces and American adjacent forces in ways that went well beyond the individual criminal actions that were prosecuted after My Lai. The Phoenix program's interrogation component involved the use of the water torture technique that would later be rediscovered and renamed waterboarding, stress positions, electrical shock applied through field telephones, and prolonged confinement in structures specifically designed to cause physical and psychological suffering. These techniques were documented in reports produced by the Office of Public Safety, the USAID program that trained South Vietnamese police, and were known to the military and civilian leadership that oversaw those programs. American advisors were present at interrogations where these techniques were used. Some participated directly. The after-action documentation of these interrogations, to the extent that it exists, was classified at levels that placed it outside the reach of most congressional oversight. Soldiers who had been present at interrogations that used techniques that clearly violated the Geneva Conventions were told that the information derived from those interrogations was intelligence, that intelligence methods were classified, and that discussion of interrogation procedures was a violation of security protocols. The legal framework that was supposed to govern the treatment of prisoners, the framework that the United States had helped write after the Second World War, was administered through a bureaucratic system that made those protections invisible at the operational level and that provided no effective recourse for people who wanted to report violations through official channels. The 19th truth, the last of the 19, is the one that underlies all the others and that makes the instruction to silence not just a tactical decision, but a structural necessity for the entire architecture of the American involvement in Vietnam. The war was not lost because of the anti-war movement. It was not lost because of media coverage. It was not lost because of political weakness at home or a failure of will among the American people. Those are the explanations that were built into the post-war narrative and that served specific political purposes. The war was lost in the sense of failing to achieve its stated objectives, because the stated objectives were not achievable by the means being employed, and because the people who designed and managed the war understood this at various points and continued anyway. The internal assessments that have been declassified, the Pentagon Papers being only the most famous of them, show a consistent pattern across administrations. Private recognition that the war was not going well, that the strategic assumptions underlying the commitment were not holding, that the South Vietnamese government could not be built into a viable political entity, that the insurgency could not be defeated by attrition alone, combined with public statements asserting the opposite. The soldiers who fought that war, who lost friends in that war, who came home from that war carrying wounds that were physical and psychological and moral, were told not to repeat what they had seen, because what they had seen was the evidence. They were the evidence. The things they had done, and the things that had been done to them, and the things that had been done in their names, constituted a record that the institutions that had sent them could not afford to have accurately reported. The instruction to silence was not about security. It was about accountability. And the reason it was so thorough and so persistent and so effective for so long is that accountability, in a war conducted on those terms, would have been unlimited. The United States withdrew from Vietnam in 1973. Saigon fell in 1975. The last American combat death in Vietnam occurred in circumstances that remain partially classified. The lessons that were drawn from the war, the formal institutional lessons, the ones written into doctrine and training, and the Weinberger Doctrine and the Powell Doctrine and all the formal frameworks that were supposed to prevent another Vietnam, were almost entirely about force structure, about exit strategies, about the conditions under which force should be committed. They were almost entirely silent about the mechanisms of institutional deception that had sustained the commitment long past the point at which honest assessment would have ended it. The Phoenix program's successors operated in subsequent wars. The dual reporting systems that had hidden the Cambodia bombing found analogues in subsequent conflicts. The instruction to soldiers not to discuss what they had witnessed in ways that would embarrass the institution was delivered again, in different words, in different wars, to different soldiers. The wall in Washington with 58,000 names is real. The silence around what those names represent has been maintained, imperfectly, across more than half a century. The documents continue to be declassified, slowly, on schedules determined by the same institutional interests that classified them. The veterans who are still alive are fewer each year. The history they carry, the history they were told never to repeat, becomes harder to verify and easier to dispute as the distance grows. The systems that produce the silences remain in place. There is something important to understand about how the silence around Vietnam was maintained, and it is not primarily about legal mechanisms, though legal mechanisms existed. It is about the culture of institutions under pressure, about how large organizations respond when the honest account of their behavior would be damaging to their continued existence and authority. Military institutions, intelligence institutions, and the political structures they serve do not suppress information because individual leaders make calculated decisions to do evil. They suppress information because they are composed of people who believe in the institution, who have invested their careers and identities in its legitimacy, and who find it genuinely difficult to distinguish between protecting the institution and protecting the country. The men who told soldiers not to repeat what they had seen in Vietnam were, in many cases, not cynics. They were true believers who had concluded that the institution's survival was more important than the accurate record of its conduct. That belief is not unique to Vietnam. It is the normal operating condition of large institutions under stress. Understanding it is not the same as accepting it. The soldiers who came back from Vietnam entered a country that was, in important ways, not prepared to hear what they had to say. The anti-war movement had created a cultural context in which the returning veteran was associated in popular imagination with atrocity, with the image of the baby killer, a slur that was applied by people who had no understanding of what those soldiers had actually faced or what they had been ordered to do. The pro-war movement had created a context in which questioning the conduct of the war was equivalent to betraying the men fighting it. Both of these contexts made honest testimony nearly impossible. The veteran who wanted to describe the reality of what the Phoenix program actually did, or what free fire zones actually meant, or what the body count actually was, found that both sides of the cultural debate had reasons to reject or distort what he was saying. The anti-war left wanted atrocity stories that confirmed their moral framework. The pro-war right wanted heroism stories that confirmed theirs. The complicated institutional procedural reality, the reality that the war had been conducted through systems specifically designed to make individual moral agency invisible, fit neither narrative. The Winter Soldier investigation, conducted in Detroit in January and February of 1971, was an attempt by Vietnam veterans against the war to create a formal public record of soldier testimony about war crimes and systematic violations of the laws of war. More than 100 veterans testified over 3 days. They described in specific detail, with names and locations and dates, operations that had involved the killing of civilians, the torture of prisoners, the destruction of villages, and the systematic falsification of official records. The testimony was specific, corroborated, and consistent across witnesses who had served in different units, different regions, and different years. The major American media, with the exception of a few outlets, largely ignored the investigation. The Defense Department dismissed it as propaganda. The veterans of foreign wars and the American Legion, the major veterans organizations, condemned it. John Kerry's Senate testimony, which drew on the Winter Soldier testimony, was nationally covered and nationally attacked. The specific testimony of the soldiers themselves, the granular detail of what they had witnessed and what they had done, remained largely outside the mainstream record for decades. Most Americans who lived through the Vietnam era have never read the Winter Soldier transcripts. Most Americans today do not know they exist. The specific geographic and demographic distribution of who served in Vietnam and who did not is another truth that was managed carefully during the war and that remained uncomfortable to discuss afterward. The draft system that filled the ranks of the military in Vietnam was not random. College deferments protected the sons of middle-class and wealthy families who had the means to pursue higher education, or who had parents with the connections to secure National Guard or reserve slots that would keep them out of combat. The soldiers who fought in Vietnam were disproportionately poor, disproportionately working class, disproportionately Black and Latino, disproportionately from rural areas, and from communities without the political and social connections that provided access to the exemption mechanisms. This was known. It was documented in the internal studies that the Defense Department and the Selective Service System conducted. The Selective Service System's own analyses showed the class and racial skew in who was actually being sent to Vietnam. Those analyses were not published. The political sensitivity of acknowledging that the burden of a war being fought in the name of American values was being distributed specifically along class and racial lines was understood to be significant. Soldiers who raised this issue, who pointed out that they were fighting a war that the sons of the people who designed it were not fighting, were told that they were undermining morale and that political observations about the draft were above their pay grade. The African-American experience of Vietnam in particular was marked by a specific and documented set of institutional inequities that were known to the command and were not addressed. Black soldiers served at rates disproportionate to their share of the population in the early years of the war, before the draft protest movement produced changes in Selective Service administration. Black soldiers were more likely to receive punitive, non-judicial punishments for disciplinary infractions than white soldiers who committed equivalent infractions. Black soldiers were underrepresented in officer ranks and overrepresented in combat infantry units. The racial tensions that were building in American society during the late 1960s did not stay outside the perimeter of American bases in Vietnam. They were present, documented in military police incident reports, in disciplinary records, in the private communications of commanders who were managing a race relations crisis within an institution that had not been designed to address one. The 1971 Defense Department report on race relations in the military, which was classified at the time, documented these patterns in detail. Soldiers who attempted to discuss the racial dynamics of their units, who raised grievances about discriminatory treatment, were frequently told that raising racial issues was itself a disciplinary problem, that it was divisive, and that the military did not recognize racial grievances as legitimate military concerns. The specific experience of soldiers who refused orders during Vietnam, who sought conscientious objector status, or who went absent without leave or deserted, has been largely written out of the official history of the war. At the peak of the anti-war resistance within the military, in the early 1970s, the desertion rate in the United States Army was approximately 70 desertions per 1,000 soldiers. Resistance newspapers were being published and distributed on military bases. Soldiers were organizing, filing legal challenges, seeking sanctuary in civilian churches and universities. The underground network that helped deserters reach Canada and Sweden was, at its peak, a significant organizational structure. The military's response to this internal resistance was, in some respects, more measured than it might have been, in part because prosecuting large numbers of soldiers for desertion would have required publicly acknowledging the scale of the problem. Selective prosecutions were conducted. Administrative discharges, which did not require courts-martial, and which produced records that would follow soldiers for the rest of their lives without the procedural protections of a trial, were used extensively. The men who received less than honorable discharges for acts of resistance that were, in many cases, responses to specific illegal orders or to specific war crimes they had been ordered to participate in, were excluded from veterans' benefits, from the GI Bill, from the educational and economic support systems that the country nominally provided to those who had served. The instruction not to speak about their resistance, enforced through the social stigma of a less than honorable discharge and the economic consequences that followed it, was as effective as any formal classification order. The hospitals that received Vietnam veterans, both the military hospitals in-country and the Veterans Administration hospitals after their return, were managing a medical reality that was in significant tension with the official account of the war's conduct. The pattern of injuries documented in those hospitals, the types of wounds, the frequency of certain categories of trauma, told a story that sometimes contradicted official accounts of specific operations. Medical personnel who treated patients whose wounds were inconsistent with the official account of how they had been injured were operating within a classification framework that told them patient information was protected and that discussing cases outside clinical contexts was prohibited. Some of those inconsistencies, the wounds that suggested a soldier had been shot by an American weapon at close range when the official record said he had been killed by enemy action. The injuries that suggested exposure to chemical agents in areas where chemical agents were officially not in use were documented in clinical records and then encountered the same classification wall that surrounded everything else. Medical personnel who had concerns about what they were seeing were directed to raise those concerns through official channels that were, in practice, not designed to receive or act on them. The intelligence community's relationship with the Vietnam War produced specific truths that were suppressed not only from the public, but from the military command itself. The CIA's assessment of the war's trajectory, which diverged significantly from the military's assessment at numerous key points, was the subject of intense institutional conflict throughout the war. The Board of National Estimates, which produced the intelligence community's formal assessments, repeatedly reached conclusions that contradicted the optimistic assessments being produced by Military Assistance Command Vietnam. Those contradictions were managed through a process that allowed the military command to contest and often dilute the intelligence community's assessments before they reached policymakers. The result was that the policymakers who were making decisions about escalation, about force levels, about the continuation of a war that was costing enormous resources and lives, were receiving assessments that had been processed through a filter that systematically removed the most pessimistic and most accurate projections. Intelligence analysts who produced the accurate assessments, who documented the gap between the official account and the operational reality, were not rewarded for accuracy. They were marginalized, reassigned, and replaced with analysts who were more willing to produce assessments that were consistent with the policy preferences of the institutions that consumed them. The specific economic interests that sustained the American commitment in Vietnam, beyond the point at which strategic logic supported it, are rarely discussed in the context of the suppressed truths of the war, but they belong in that company. The defense industry that produced the aircraft, the munitions, the equipment, and the logistical infrastructure of the war was generating revenues at scales that had no peacetime equivalent. The communities and congressional districts in which that industry was based had specific and powerful economic interests in the war's continuation. The career incentives within the military establishment, which during the Vietnam War produced a culture of careerism in which officers competed for command time in Vietnam because command time was necessary for promotion, meant that the institutional interests of the officer corps were not, in every case, aligned with the fastest possible termination of the conflict. These interests are rarely described in terms as direct as this, because doing so sounds reductive and conspiratorial, but the documentary record supports a more straightforward assessment than the official history tends to provide. The classified economic analyses that were produced within the Defense Department, the studies that examined the industrial and institutional incentive structures around the war, were not released into the public record because their contents were genuinely damaging to the credibility of the institutions that had produced them. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 are described in the official history as a negotiated settlement that ended American involvement in the war. The private assessments of the Accords, produced by the intelligence community and by State Department analysts at the time, described them in terms that were considerably more pessimistic. The assessment that North Vietnam would use the period of ceasefire to rebuild and reposition its forces for a final offensive was widespread within the intelligence community and was accurate. The assessment that the South Vietnamese government could not survive without continued American material support was also widespread, was also accurate, and was also not what was being told to the American public. The soldiers and advisors who remained in Vietnam after the Accords, who watched the ceasefire violations begin almost immediately, who understood from their operational experience that what was being called peace was simply a pause before the final phase of the war, were operating within a classification system that told them that assessments of the ceasefire's durability were classified information. The people who knew that the war's outcome was already determined were instructed to behave as though it was not. The final collapse of South Vietnam in April 1975 produced a specific category of suppressed truth that has received somewhat more attention than most of the others, but that is still not fully part of the public record. The intelligence warnings that preceded the final North Vietnamese offensive, the assessments that predicted the offensive's scale and timing, were accurate. They were produced. They were received. They were not acted upon in ways that would have changed the outcome, partly because the political will to act was not present in Congress after the war powers battles of the preceding years, and partly because acting would have required acknowledging that the Paris Peace Accords had failed and that the premise on which American forces had been withdrawn was fraudulent. The people who had to be evacuated in the final days, the South Vietnamese who had worked for the American government and who had been promised protection, the CIA assets who had risked their lives for years on the basis of American assurances, were caught in the gap between what the official position maintained and what the operational reality had become. The classified lists of people who were to be evacuated were incomplete. The procedures that were supposed to govern the evacuation had never been seriously planned, because planning them would have required officially acknowledging a contingency that the political leadership had committed to preventing. What the Vietnam War left behind, in addition to its dead and its veterans and its physical devastation across an entire region of the world, was a set of institutional practices that had been refined under the pressure of sustained deception. The classification system had been used not primarily to protect operational security from foreign adversaries, but to protect political decisions from domestic accountability. The intelligence community had been pushed and had in some cases volunteered to produce assessments that conformed to policy rather than contradicting it. The military command had built reporting structures that systematically inflated favorable metrics and suppressed unfavorable ones. The legal frameworks that were supposed to govern the conduct of war had been administered through bureaucratic processes that made them invisible at the operational level. The medical and benefit systems that were supposed to care for the people who had fought the war had been used as tools to minimize the officially acknowledged damage. All of these practices existed before Vietnam. All of them were strengthened and institutionalized by the war's demands. The Church Committee, the Senate investigations of the 1970s, the Freedom of Information Act litigation, the decades of document declassification that followed, revealed the outlines of these practices. They did not dismantle them. The institutions that had developed them remained. The people who had operated them retired with their careers and their reputations largely intact. The soldiers who had been told not to speak grew older. The documents continued to be declassified on schedules set by the same institutional interest that had classified them. The war ended. The systems that had made the war possible, that had sustained it, that had managed its costs and concealed its realities, those systems did not end with it. They were available for the next time they were needed, and they were needed again.